Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Not only a massive opportunity for Nebraska to go on the road and notch a top 20 win against Indiana, an undefeated Indiana team at that, not only an opportunity for Nebraska to become bowl eligible in the 2024 season. I think a fascinating conversation surrounding this Indiana football game for Nebraska is if Nebraska goes on the road and takes care of business, there's a real picture for this Nebraska team to get themselves into that college football playoff conversation come the month of November. Now, I get that is kind of looking forward a little bit. There's still a lot that needs to play out on the football field, not only for Nebraska, but for teams around the country. But you start looking at the pathway and you start looking at the schedule in the month of October and November and say, there's a real opportunity for Nebraska to be in that conversation at the end of November. Want to get into two different conversations. One, want to take a look at the pathway to the college football playoffs for Nebraska. I think more importantly, or just as importantly, talk about what do we need to see from this Nebraska team to really morph into a college football playoff caliber team come the end of November. Really excited to get into this one. Now, before we do, and as always, to the Nebraska fans, I can't thank you guys enough for all the support. Many of y'all know this is a program I love talking about. The amount of support you guys show means the absolute world. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, let's get into this one. Now, we talked about this matchup on Sunday with Indiana. It's largely a football game where not totally sure what to expect, I think, because you're not really sure what Indiana is as a football team, where you look at the eyeball test, you look at them play on Saturdays and say, this Indiana team looks really, really good. But then you look at the caliber of teams they've played and say, all right, the best win they have is probably against Maryland, who just lost at home against Northwestern by 3 scores. So Indiana has looked really good. You don't really know what they're going to look like against a caliber of team like Nebraska. Now, Nebraska heads into this football game as an underdog, but I would certainly argue that I don't even know if I look at Nebraska as an underdog in this football game. Now, I want to get into the conversation of if Nebraska can go on the road and take care of business, well, what's the back half of the schedule look like if you're a Nebraska fan? And I would argue two different things. One, you look at how the SEC is playing out. A lot of those teams that we thought were not locks, but favorites to be in that college football playoff conversation. One, the SEC seems to be just kind of engulfing each other outside of Texas at the top. You look at Georgia, significant question marks. You look at Alabama, significant question marks. You look at Tennessee, big time question marks. Ole Miss already has 2 losses. Across the country, there's been a lot of chaos at the top of this sport in that college football playoff conversation. So, 3-4 weeks ago, I thought we had maybe 4 SEC teams penciled in to the college football playoffs. I don't know if that's kind of where we sit right now. And then you look at the schedule for Nebraska after Indiana and say, it's hard to see and pick Nebraska to go on the road against Ohio State, who's coming off a bye, and win that football game. But then you look at the back half of the schedule, the last 5 football games on the schedule, and say, I could see Nebraska winning out in the month of November, right? You start at home against UCLA, one of the worst teams in the Big Ten. If Nebraska is a college football playoff caliber team, that should be a comfortable win. Then you get a bye week before you go on the road and say, that's probably the toughest game remaining on Nebraska's schedule, going on the road to USC. A couple of different reasons why I like Nebraska in that matchup. And I want to start with, I think USC is a much better football team than the 3-3 record says. More importantly, you look at USC and where they're going. Our biggest concern for USC heading into 2024 was depth, specifically in the front 7. You look at where this USC team sits now and say, they're All-American linebacker Eric Gentry. He's going to be out for the season. They just lost a starting edge rusher in Anthony Lucas for the rest of the season. We were nervous about the depth coming in for USC. If there was a point where you wanted to play USC, it'd be at the end of the season. That's where Nebraska gets them and say, from a depth standpoint, I think Nebraska's got a really good chance at going on the road and knocking off USC, who's just becoming kind of a depleted roster over the last couple of weeks. And you look at how that game might match up and say Nebraska, obviously really, really good along the lines of scrimmage, specifically on the defensive line. The biggest question mark we have for USC so far is this offensive line and pass protection. USC's primarily been having a lot of success running the football. It's hard to see them have a ton of success rushing against the top 5 rushing defense in the country that Nebraska has. There's a lot of things where you look at that football game and say, there are a lot of reasons to be confident if you're a Nebraska team, especially coming off a bye and then going on the road to California. You get Wisconsin back at home. They're down to the quarterback too. Again, that's one of those games that if you think Nebraska is a college football playoff caliber team, they should be taking care of business. Then you go on the road to Kinnick Stadium. We all know that is a very hard place to play, very hard place to win. If you guys have listened to me talk about the Big Ten, I don't have a ton of success or ton of optimism, I should say, about this Iowa football team. And again, you kind of like the matchup where this Iowa defense is not the defense we kind of expected to see coming into the season. They're not a top 10 ranked defense like we normally see at Iowa. And I think more importantly, where is the success coming on the offensive side of the football? It's from their star running back and Caleb. And again, this kid is very hard to deal with. That being said, you look at Nebraska, you look at the run game, say it's hard to see Caleb Johnson running all over this Nebraska defense. So from a matchup standpoint, you kind of like how Nebraska matches up against Iowa. You kind of like how Nebraska matches up against USC. Now, UCLA and Wisconsin, I don't think it matters what the matchup is. Nebraska is just the better team. If they are the better team that day, they should win comfortably. I mean, you're looking at with a win at Indiana, you're looking at a very realistic 10-2 season. That's going to get you in the conversation. And at the very least, it's going to kind of depend on what the other teams are doing around Nebraska at the top of college football. And the way I look at it right now is say there's only one team that's getting in from the Big 12. They're certainly not getting 2 in. Then you look at the SEC and say big time question marks about how many teams are going to get in from that conference. And then the ACC is probably only getting 2 in from Miami and Clemson. I look at the pathway, not only the schedule for Nebraska, but I think more importantly, the surrounding college football landscape and say a 10-2 Nebraska team at the end of the year, that's at least going to put you in the conversation of getting into the college football playoffs. I don't know if I'm going to pick Nebraska to make the college football playoffs, but it is certainly a possibility the way we're seeing this college football season play out. Now, that the second part of the conversation that I want to get into is, what do we need to see from Nebraska over the next 6 football games to kind of make sure they're a college football playoff team? I think the number one thing, and if this is the peak Nebraska playing their best football, I think you got 2 things you got to make sure you take care of. One, the special teams. I don't think there's that much to add from an analysis standpoint. You just got to do the fundamentals right, especially the field goal kicking unit. It's just got to figure itself out. I think secondly and most importantly, Nebraska needs to find a little bit more efficiency and explosiveness in the run game. This is how Matt Rhule wants to build this program. And again, Dylan is giving you a ton of juice in the passing game. I think you got a couple NFL caliber wide receivers on the outside, but I look at the run game and say, 3.6 yards per carry. That's 90th in the country. I think Matt Rhule said it right. We're leaving a lot of yards and a lot of runs out there on the football field. I think the Nebraska offensive line, especially with some of those inside zone concepts, they're blocking up pretty damn well in the run game. I think it kind of falls more on the running back play to get this running game going. And that's something we don't normally say. Normally, when you can't run the football, or you struggle to run the football, it kind of falls on the offensive line just not winning up front. I don't think that's the case for Nebraska. The more and more I watch this Nebraska offense, say this offensive line is, I think, largely moving bodies off the line of scrimmage and creating some space for these running backs. You want to see these running backs get a little bit more going on the ground game. And you kind of look at the numbers and say, you've only had 9 carries that have gone 15 plus yards. 3 of them have come from Ja'Cory Barney on some of these end arounds. The kid's so special, but it's not necessarily the running game Nebraska's looking for. You look at Dante Dowdle, the lead back, he's only got 1 carry of 15 plus yards. I don't necessarily know the fix. And Matt Rhule said this heading into 2024. We're trying to have a running back emerge from this running back room. You look at Nebraska, say we got 4 running backs that we trust a lot. We're trying to get 1 or 2 of them to kind of emerge. And I think you went into the bye week not necessarily sure who's the best running back in that room. Now, Dante Dowdle's been the guy that's gotten most of the work. I would probably argue from what I've seen from my two eyeballs, granted, I'm not a genius football mind, is Emmett and Ramir Johnson have looked better at times. I mean, you look at what Ramir Johnson can do out of the backfield. That's absolutely massive. And I think more importantly, you're struggling to see Dante Dotto make people miss at the second level. He's gotten to the second level plenty of times, and that kind of vertical running style that Dante Dowdle has, I love it, especially in the short yards. And I think that's how Nebraska wants to run the football. But you have to be able to marry that I'm going to attack the line of scrimmage with a little bit of elusiveness when you get linebackers in space. And you look at which running backs for Nebraska have been able to do that. I would argue it's Emmett Johnson or Amir Johnson. And so I'm kind of interested coming out of the bye week if you see a little bit of a shakeup in terms of the workload at the running back position. Because I look at it and say 3.6 yards per carry, 90th in the country. This Nebraska rushing attack can be significantly better than that. If they can figure that out and kind of have that multidimensionality in terms of how you're going to attack the defense, I think that kind of brings Nebraska's offense up to a second gear. And you look at this Nebraska defense and say, we had a few question marks for them coming in. We knew they'd be a good unit. We weren't sure how good of a unit they'd be. They're forcing turnovers. I think most importantly, they're creating more negative plays. We saw Nebraska create a lot of chaos last year. They were obviously a very good defense under 2023, but we wanted to see those sack numbers go up. You look at the number and say 10.5% sack rate on opponents' dropbacks. That's number 5 in the country. That's what we're looking for. Like the emergence of Prince Will You and James Williams coming off the edge, that's taken this Nebraska defense up a notch from 2023. I think the emergence of Sayre right at the cornerback position, another massive question was the depth at cornerback. Kind of got that answered. I look at this Nebraska defense and say it's starting to fire on all cylinders. If you can fix the special teams, if you can get a little bit more out of the run game, I look at this Nebraska team and say that there's room for improvement for Nebraska. I think they're a top 25 team in college football right now, and I think they can take it up a notch. And if you can do that, I think you win every single game on your schedule outside of on the road against Ohio State. I think you put yourself 10-2 in the thick of that college football playoff conversation. Fired up to see how this season ends. This 12-team playoff, it's going to be really fun for a lot of these teams like Nebraska, where, Nebraska might not be a top 5 team in the country, but they certainly can get into that 10-20 range. That's when it gets fun in November football. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later.